So I'd like to introduce the last talk of this session, David Sontag, Associate Professor at MIT in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory and the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science, IMES at MIT. He's also Chief Health Strategist at ASAPP, an AI startup in New York City, go New York. Building a product to empower patients with chronic disease through the lens of their health data. David is leading now this clinical machine learning group that seeks to advance the state of the art in safe, robust, and fair machine learning. His group at MIT is collaborating with the Partners Health System, with the Brigham MGH, to find patients with undiagnosed type 2 diabetes, as well as other diseases using his methodology in multiple myeloma, rheumatoid arthritis, Parkinson's disease, and heart disease. Previously, David was an assistant professor in computer science and data science at NYU and a postdoc at Microsoft Research. He received multiple awards for his work, as well as his involvement in multiple initiatives. He's also has spent some time and received awards from Google, Facebook, Adobe, and NSF Career Award. And he obtained his BA at the University of California, Berkeley. So David, please, welcome.
So thanks very much for inviting me here today. My disclosures were just all mentioned. So I'm a computer scientist, and as a computer scientist, this picture to me is really exciting, talking about the broad adoption of electronic medical records here in the United States. When I started in working in healthcare, it was about 2010, 2011, and in the subsequent 6-7 years, almost every single health institution here in the United States now has access to the data that I need both to do my research as a machine learning person and also to start to deploy the algorithms that I'm building in clinical practice. But although that presents enormous opportunity for me, it also represents part of the problem. And so at the same time, we've seen an increase in physician burnout, largely due to increased effort of documentation, and we see healthcare costs continuing to rise. And so what I want to talk to you about today is how one could use artificial intelligence to completely redesign electronic medical records, to see how one can improve context that one provides on patients at the point of care, to improve the way that diagnosis can be done, to make documentation faster, more accurate, and finally to help with treatment recommendations. So with regards to AI context, I think it all begins with understanding the patient's past medical history and their current medical situation. So what we've been working on in my lab are algorithms that can take electronic medical record data as you have it. So that might be longitudinal data of notes across time, laboratory test results, records of what medications the patients are taking. And we want to be able to turn that using these machine learning and natural language processing algorithms into a structured record that looks at what is the patient's past conditions and why are they here in the clinic today. And once one has that type of structured data, you can drive a number of downstream changes to the electronic medical record. For example, there are a number of risk scores that currently make use of qualitative information as input. One example that I'm citing here is from our work on sepsis, where altered mental status is an example of an input to some sepsis risk scores, but is something which today is not actually structured data, and so it needs someone to enter it. Another example is suspected infection, something that we showed how one can very easily derive in an automated manner from the electronic medical record. But going a little bit beyond that, once you have a structured understanding of a patient, it also opens the door to thinking about how one can bring from your past medical record, how you can surface just the right information to help with the current clinical context. So For about 6 years now, we've been working on doing this in collaboration with Bethesda Deaconess Medical Center. And here what I'm showing you is just a few examples of conditions, both historical and acute, which we are continuously predicting in real time as part of their electronic medical record system. And these conditions are driving a number of downstream use cases that I'll describe in a second. But before I do so, I want to just give you a bit of insight into what is driving these predictions. So let's look at one of these models, in particular cardiac etiology. So what I'm showing here are the features that are predictive of a patient having a cardiac etiology for a patient who's in the ER today. So you see how, of course, old age is predictive. You see in orange there are medications coming from medication reconciliation, so past medications. In gray on the right-hand side are medications that are being provided while they're in the hospital. And in blue are words from both triage and attending notes that are also predictive of the patient having cardiac etiology. And these all make sense to some extent, but it also gives us some insight into how doing this with a non-machine learning approach could be very challenging. For example, in the text data, there are a lot of shorthands that are very specific to this institution, like CMED, which stands for cardiac medicine. And the machine learning algorithms can just automatically pick those up and recognize, oh, this patient has cardiac etiology. And so we've been using these then to, for example, automatically surface order sets that are specific to patients who have psych conditions or who have come into the ER complaining of chest pain. We use it to surface decision support, clinical decision support. For example, here, this is for a patient who is suspected to have cellulitis. And so we pop up onto the dashboard, enroll into this pathway, and it's a way of helping really standardize medical care for patients of each particular kind. Joint with NYU Langone here in the city, we worked on finding patients who are in the hospital today but who have heart failure so that one could then take interventions while they're still within your reach, within the hospital, to try to prevent readmissions in the future. What we found, for example, on the right-hand side here, I'm showing for 3 different types of common interventions that you'd like to do, or quality metrics, what different types of algorithms are able to detect. So on the very left-hand side, the darkest colors are the simplest algorithms that, for example, look at a patient's problem list to see is heart failure mentioned in the problem list. And as you move to the right, to the white bar charts, you see that corresponds to algorithms that are based on these machine learning approaches that I'm describing earlier. And we find that for each of these different quality metrics, we can find substantially more patients who have not actually had each of these interventions by using these techniques. Now, moving on to thinking about AI-driven documentation, the goal here is to improve the way that documentation is done, but we'd also like to be able to collect better data for future research and quality purposes. And one of the ways to collect better data is to start to collect structured data directly. But collecting structured data is often very tedious. So how can we think about redesigning clinical documentation to both make it faster and collect better data as a result? I want to talk about a very simple intervention that we did already going back 6 years, also in the emergency department at Bethesda Deaconess. And this has been running live for all 60,000 patients per year that come to that ER for the last 6 years. What we did is we asked the very simple question: could we derive a higher quality chief complaint from the electronic medical record? We started by redesigning the home to our workflow. Rather than the chief complaint being the first thing that a triage nurse will document, we make it the last thing after taking the patient's vitals, typing up a triage note, and so on. And then we take that data, which I'm showing in the very top here, and we both automatically predict a few chief complaints that we think are the right chief complaints for this patient, and we also have the ability to have a text box with contextual autocomplete. So a nurse can start typing in one of the letters within the chief complaint they're looking for, and rather than just suggesting other chief complaints that have those letters, we automatically reorder them by what we predict to be the ones that they're looking for based on what we know about this patient. And this has led both to a substantial increase in the standardization of chief complaints at this institution. So going from roughly 20 to 30% when this algorithm was just before it was deployed, to close to 100% today. And at the same time, it also significantly reduced the amount of time it took to find and enter chief complaints. So this plot is showing the number of keystrokes required to enter in certain fraction of chief complaints. And you see that even with no keystrokes, you get up to 80% of the complaints. And on average, we found that the number of keystrokes needed is 0.6 compared to 11.6 if you hadn't used this system. So move on to the last example, which is that of AI-driven treatment recommendations. There are many ways in which we could use AI to improve treatment recommendations, from doing outlier detection to recognize when there might be an error in an order, to improving adherence to clinical guidelines like I suggested earlier. But what I want to focus on right now is this last bullet point of personalized treatment decisions. And so as a case study, I want to talk about antibiotic prescribing. This is joint work with an infectious disease clinician, and what he came to me with a few years ago is this problem, that one wants to really try to minimize the amount of second-line antibiotic usage so as to prevent the future development of antibiotic-resistant organisms. But at the same time, one wants to try to give the right antibiotic to patients so that it resolves their infection that they have. So you have this tension. And so what we wanted to do is, can we guide empiric antibiotic prescribing to balance between giving as little inappropriate therapy as possible and minimizing the use of second-line antibiotics? And we focused on uncomplicated urinary tract infection as a very low-risk scenario to start to develop these machine learning algorithms. We used 11,000 women from the MGH and Brigham Health System. We trained our algorithms using data from 2011 to 2007, 2011, and evaluated it then in the subsequent couple of years. What we saw is that current clinical practice had inappropriate therapy given in 10% of the time and second-line antibiotic given 35% of the time. Using our reinforcement learning algorithms, what we obtained was a new recommendation algorithm which had inappropriate therapy only 8% of the time and gave substantially fewer, only 12% of second-line antibiotics. By the way, compare that to an existing clinical guideline. Existing clinical guidelines, if they were to be followed, would have inappropriate therapy 13% of the time and almost no second-line usage. But I think it's really because of the fact that the inappropriate therapy is so high that clinicians are not currently really following these guidelines. So our research has been looking at how does one scale this up and how does one make these algorithms very robust. For example, in the AI-driven context case, how does one not have to label much data in order to build these algorithms that can transform the unstructured clinical data into structured data? For the AI-driven documentation, right now we are both redesigning user interfaces, but also developing machine learning algorithms that can provide immediate wins to clinicians if they're getting structured data using our approaches. And finally, for treatment recommendations, the antibiotic resistance case is somewhat of an easy case because we have the antibiogram, which gives us an insight of what would have happened had you taken a different antibiotic. But in order to really deploy these algorithms across a much broader set of clinical scenarios, we need good causal inference algorithms that can work with high-dimensional observational data. And we also need to have a very good understanding of when our algorithms are uncertain and how to explain our predictions so that we can surface those at the right time. And to conclude, what I've described right now, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg for how one can rethink electronic medical records. It's going to have broader impact. For example, having better structured data is going to improve also the ability to do billing and research. And to conclude, this work has been done with a team of phenomenal people. Thanks.